within Dalits more specifically, is 16% bigger than the national average of India. That means that if you compare Dalits with upper caste, the gap is going to be much times bigger than that. It's comparing Dalits with the average of India, of course. And just to give a measure of like the demographic impact of those vulnerable groups, estimations point out that the aggregate population of SCs, STs, and Muslims account to 37% of the population. On figure 2 below, you see a headcount ratio of poverty across social groups. That makes it clear how like scheduled tribes are the worst off groups, followed by scheduled castes. And then you have the average poverty incidence for India, and you have the upper caste on the best off situation, or maybe it would be better to say the least worst off situation, wherein they have a poverty of incidence accounting to 22% of the population of upper caste in India. As I don't have time to pass through all the 6 Millennium Development Goals I analyzed, I will just quickly show you how I proceeded with Millennium Development Goal number 1 and the program which is more directly aiming to fulfill this Millennium Development Goal in India, so that you can understand what is the proposal of my work. The Millennium Development Goal number 1 aims at eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, and the UN normally tracks progress for this Millennium Development Goal through looking at 2 parameters. One is the incidence of poverty, the head count for poor people in the country, and the other is the percentage of underweight persons in the population, mostly the percentage of underweight children, which is a much more sensitive group. And as we look at the progress for those 2 parameters, disaggregating in terms of social groups to which they belong, then again you can see that they're lagging far behind both the Indian national average and even more from the progress for upper caste. You see that upper caste are represented on this line, which is marked by a yellow triangle. They have much lesser levels of incidence of poverty, and you see that scheduled tribes are the worst off there in pink, and scheduled castes are also worse than the Indian population. As you look to percentage, the parameter of percentage of underweight children, you see that the pattern pretty much stands, even though the gap is not so big. Though here I must make a comment, because even though the gap is not so big, it might be much more difficult to overcome this gap, because just giving a quick, as it's oversimplifying example, you can lift people up relatively simple through a cash transfer program, in a few months. But it takes years to give people out from like food insecure positions, like to reestablish the nutritional balance, and sometimes people get permanently affected if they don't get properly fed between 0 and 5 years old. I understand that the social program in India that is more directly concerned to promote Millennium Development Goal number 1 is the people distribution system, which is the biggest program of its nature in the world. It's a program of public acquisition of food from small farmers and public distribution of food that's subsidized at very cheap prices for families below poverty line and just above poverty line. How it operates in India is that the central government is responsible for food procurement, food acquisition and bulk allocation of food, whereas the state authorities are responsible for enrolling the beneficiaries and promoting the offtake of food. How does this offtake is promoted? They choose certain private agencies to be ahead of the fair price shops, wherein people will be able to ultimately buy the subsidized food. And when we look at the amount of food distribution fair price shops available per village, we see that majority of villages just have one fair price shop. That already tells us a little bit about the scarcity, the shadow of scarcity that kind of hunts the program. The demand is much bigger than the supply. There is more demand for fair price shops than the actual offer of fair price shops. And normally, in situations of scarcity, the scarcity tends to be unevenly transferred to vulnerable groups. And trying to access whether that stands for India, we see that indeed there is a caste-based bias. When you look at the geographical position of fair price shops, we see that the majority of them are on upper caste areas, and that reveals a caste-based bias for 2 main aspects. First, when you're talking about people below poverty line, and it's not even the World Bank below poverty line, it's the Indian below poverty line, which is even smaller. We're not talking about people who have facility to transport themselves to other places and, like, transport food. But there's a lot of logistical impediments on that. Never mind the logistical barriers, there are also cultural barriers to the extent that these people are hostilized very often. They're subject to violence, and sometimes the lower caste cannot go into an upper caste neighborhood without being disrespected, being subjected to violence, sometimes even physical violence. And in figure 7, we have an even more clear evidence of the caste bias of the program, since most owners of fair price shops are actually people who belong to upper caste. You see that in most villages, around 80% of the shops belong to these people. And it's expected that, these people are going to reproduce the casteist logic and behaviors according to which they're much better off in society. Yeah, like just very quickly, 1 minute of. Yeah, I found out 4 main streams during the research, the fieldwork research, and now we found out 4 main streams of caste-based discrimination. The most common, the most reported stream of caste-based discrimination is when the dealer, the owner of the fair price shop, favors their own caste people. It's like there's no food for everybody, but they systematically give preference to distributing this food for people of their own caste. There is the second biggest stream is that of discrimination in terms of quantity, and the third biggest stream is that of discrimination in terms of price. And it's interesting to point out that in 26% of the cases, people mentioned that they actually had to face dealer practicing untouchability, which is the most classic, the most overt, and the most explicit kind of casteist violence, where the owner of the shop just does not allow lower caste or lower tribes to step into the shop. Then I finally jump to the conclusions, which are not necessarily drawn only from this part of my research, they are drawn from the overall of the research, the 6 cases I analyzed. And the first thing I see is that SCs and OBCs will probably not fulfill any of the Millennium Development Goals until 2015. India in the overall might achieve, but those vulnerable groups will most likely not achieve any of those Millennium Development Goals. And I propose that the state should give more emphasis and produce more data on vulnerable castes and tribes, so that to talk about this very sensible aspect, we don't have to run very expensive surveys and do very complex econometric projections crisscrossing of data. They can just ask consensus, a lot of parameters which would help to have a more clear image of this bias. That also shows that multi-vulnerability approach is decisive for reduction of caste-led exclusion errors, and that active participation of beneficiaries in the organization of the program as one of the biggest covariates leading to a successful targeting. That's pretty much all. I thank you for your attention and invite you all to submit any comments to this debate there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Pedro. Pedro has raised many questions, and especially a question on challenging methodologies we need when dealing with social inequalities on the ground. We have Professor Mikhail Chernysh kindly joining us today. I won't repeat Tom's words, but I want to tell you that Professor Chernysh does research with middle classes and transition in post-socialist countries, and he has a very long book on social classes and social change in contemporary Russia. He teaches at the Institute of Sociology in the Russian Academy of Science. Thank you, Professor Mikhail.
Thank you. Well, of course. In these sessions dedicated to BRICS problems, BRICS agenda, we often raise the question of social justice. Yesterday, Professor Sharma spoke about the situation in India, and he used the term social justice to describe it, or rather lack of social justice. Lack of social justice and inequality that is rampant in India. Today, our first report was dedicated to another instance of a violation of the principles of social justice. So social justice seems to be a burning problem for most BRICS societies. That's the conclusion to which we came when we met in Udaipur at the Congress of the Indian Sociological Association, where we discussed the problems of the BRICS. We talked about social justice and decided that it is a problem that is common to all societies, all BRICS societies. But then there is an important question. What is social justice? We all feel internally when the principles of social justice are violated. When a judge issues a sentence to a poor man of several years and to a rich man of several months, we know that social injustice has been committed. We know that something is wrong, although the law has not been violated, but there is injustice there. We always feel that the injustice. We always feel the principles of justice in our daily life and seek to establish them within the bounds of our authority. So it's an internal feeling, it's our own perception. It's an emotion that comes through when we discuss the problems of social justice. But emotions are not enough to formalize the concept of social justice when we try to study it in the BRICS states. We need a more formal definition of it. And while discussing that formal definition, we have to reject certain hypotheses that become widespread as far as the concept of social justice is concerned. First of all, the first concept is that social justice is individual matter. It's the individual view of things. Each of us has his or her own view of social justice. And so when one person sees an event as unjust, the other person may see it as just. So there isn't any common ground upon which we can judge society as being just or unjust. This is the ontological individualism principle as the basis for the judgment of social justice. However, we all know that common approach to social justice